Scholars use masculinity to refer to different things. Sometimes masculinity is used to refer to an individual man's sense or understanding of what it means to be a man for them. Other times, we use masculinity to refer to broad social expectations around how all men should behave, for acceptable dress, for example, or how men should speak. In other instances, we use masculinity to refer to ideals or archetypes, the kinds of things that we might hope men live up to, but don't expect that all of them will. In my own scholarship, I use an understanding of masculinities as the plural and often competing ways to be a man within a given society. For example, in Britain, you might have one model of masculinity, say for a politician, which is centered around a man's ability to exert expertise, leadership, or to make decisions in society. For another man connected with the trades, it might be about his ability to work with his hands, to be physically useful. These different models of masculinity will often contain not just distinct, but directly oppositional ideas about how men should behave, and there are often many competing models within a given society. Masculinities operate in relation to violent extremism on a few different levels. The first one is the one that's often more obvious, that individual men can join violent groups with the hope of gaining a sense of manhood through their participation. This can involve the desire to seek adventure, to stand up for the weak, to fight for a cause, things that will fit within individual men's conception of their own identity. On an organisational level, violent extremist groups often also contain specific ideology or sets of ideas about how men should behave and the kind of society that they want to produce based on that. You see this within far-right groups, for example, who will often preach messages around a loss of masculinity in society, or that men have gone soft. These ideologies will also often contain specific messages around what tactics or techniques are acceptable for a group to use. And importantly, who can use them? Are women allowed to use violence, for example? Third, we can think about masculinities at a societal level. Are men and boys being raised within a society to valorize violence and to use violence as a necessary and acceptable response to, for example, experiences of humiliation, or as a way to resolve their problems? To the question of whether there's a crisis of masculinity, the answer is both. There is always a crisis of masculinity, and substantively not. Throughout the 20th century, at least within Western societies, you constantly see language around a crisis of masculinity. That in the past, men used to be men, women used to be women, and each knew how to do their roles. However, when you look back through all of these times, there's always a competing idea about how masculinity should be done. So in the 1950s, there was crises of masculinity. In the 1930s and the 70s and the 80s and the 2000s. So on a kind of more base level, there is perpetually discourses around crisis of masculinity. And that's because men's roles are constantly changing in society, and these changes are often looked down upon. Isn't it sad that there's no longer heavy labour in heavy industry in the UK, for example? Men have lost the potential to work meaningfully. Isn't it sad that there's no more chivalry and that men have lost the ability to be honourable? These discourses of crises are, in one sense, not really a crisis. They're a perpetual feature of the gender order. On, I guess, a more substantive level, what I would say is not a crisis of masculinity, but an element of backlash politics. The second half of the 20th century in a country like Britain has seen rapid shifts in gender expectations for women, for queer people, that have impacted on men quite directly. And there are what I would see as specific symptoms that have come out as a response to that. For example, the decline of men as the sole family provider for middle-class families that has then resulted in some men feeling like their position is undermined, weakened, or they don't know how they should relate to their role. However, I think calling this a crisis is a misunderstanding. There is a shift in gender expectations for men, and for some men, this has led to significant direct impacts on their lives. However, those shifts for others has been really positive. the expectations for how all young men are expected to relate to masculinity, whether they should be participating in team sports or forming what I would think of as a butch model of masculinity. For some, that's a crisis. For others, that's an opportunity. Whether those models fit your experience and desires will be seen as a crisis or harmful. So I think when we're talking about crises, we need to keep in mind how these shifts have worked, especially for the rise of the manosphere and sort of far-right movements. But I wouldn't buy into the language of crisis. It gives it too much credence as a legitimate concern. I think extremist rhetoric often specifically and effectively targets young men for recruitment and appeals to grievances, concerns that they have. I think the language of vulnerability to recruitment is deleterious to our understanding of the phenomenon. When we think about any other form of recruitment to a militarized movement, for example, which communities are most likely to be recruited into state armed forces, do we talk about young men being vulnerable to joining the armed forces? No. It's not a productive framework for understanding what's going on. Substantively, though, having spoken to violent extremist recruiters in Indonesia, they are very conscious that they are trying to push on pressure points that young men have. A quest for identity, for meaning in society, in a context where you might feel like you don't know how to be a man, and you certainly don't think you're going to get recognition as one, whether that's through access to a partner, through wealth or social stability, or where you see great injustice in your context and you feel like as a man, you have to do something about that. Recruiters know what they're doing and they do target those things directly. However, I don't think it's useful to talk about that as vulnerability. I would instead say that is a context where masculinity makes them readily able to be recruited and that the messages of violent extremism can appeal to them. So I've studied a range of different countries that have either experienced civil conflict or countries where men have joined violent groups. In some of these, for example, in South Sudan, this is a context where they experienced many decades of civil war over multiple generations. In a context like Indonesia, this is a space, at least for Java, which is the main island in Indonesia, where they've not had civil conflict over a long period of time, recently at least, but they do have issues with recruitment to violent networks. In comparison between these two spaces, you will see some real differences. For example, the central role that joining a militant group has had in South Sudan has provided in many instances one of the main pathways for young men to get power, recognition, but also security. Young men in that context are quite vulnerable if they don't have connection to some kind of armed group. In a context like Java in Indonesia, there is not that level of vulnerability. War hasn't shaped the society in the same way, but there are mainstream ideas about militarism which valorize young men standing up for the weak violently and protecting their interests of their community through the use of force. Again, within each of these contexts, there are many different models of masculinity that really contrast that. In South Sudan, you have a really important role of religious leaders who are often directly opposed to violence and have worked very hard to try and negotiate peace. In Indonesia, you have a wide range, for example, of young queer activists who engage with their masculinity totally differently. So I think it's very difficult to provide broad-based comparisons. I think, however, when you're talking about what I would think of as hegemonic masculinity, which is sort of the most rewarded model of masculinity in society, which is used to produce consent from other men, you often see some common elements across lots of different contexts. The ones that I would think of as being particularly prevalent, for example, is an emphasis on brotherhood, that men's relationships with male peers are prioritized over other relationships. An emphasis on risk-taking, that young men especially should be willing to take risks in order to prove that they are men. An emphasis on legitimacy of violence, that violence is an acceptable and necessary response to a range of problems. Emotional detachment, that young men shouldn't engage with a full array of emotions, usually only a more constrained model. And aggressive heterosexuality, The idea that young men should and need to be focused on acquiring access to women's bodies if they are to prove that they are men. However, that being said, this stuff looks really different, even for different groups of men in one society. And so it's quite difficult to make broad-based generalizations. That's a really interesting question. You know, there's some very compelling research which would suggest that even in groups that have significant roles for women, Al-Shabaab, for example, that men are still often dominant, but that the gender expectations that are put on men are not necessarily less violent or patriarchal. So I think it can be sometimes a mistake to think of this as a purely like arithmetic problem. If you have enough women, an organization won't be as bad. Instead, what I would say is many organizations are very male-dominated, both because their ideology often is centered around what Iris Marion Young would refer to as the logic of masculinist protection, that, you know, men need to be protecting women and the weak, and they need to do that through violence. And that means that those groups often don't accept women into their membership. The other reason why you often see this within quite a wide range of organizations is that within societies, women are often not socialized to use violence as a legitimate, acceptable, inevitable response to conflicts that they face. And so the appeal of the group is often lesser. How that manifests within a specific group, I think, is going to really vary based on what the group is, what their ideology is, and that gets difficult to generalize about. But in many groups, you'll see things like a central role of male bonding, that recruitment processes often involve processes of initiation or of group bonding sessions that are really important, and the fact that it is a homosocial space, a space for men to be men, is part of the recruitment strategy. When far-right groups in Australia wanted to recruit more young men, they set up what were called lads societies, spaces where young men could go and do martial arts, do bodybuilding, talk to each other about being men. And the fact that these were coded masculine spaces was really important. It was really appealing because young men felt like they needed a space to explore their masculinity in the company of men. But that dynamic isn't there for all other groups, so it's difficult to draw broad comparisons. So the manosphere refers to a collection of different online communities, ideologies, and actors that have coalesced around male supremacy, as I would think of it. These look really different. You have some groups, for example, pickup artists who are primarily concerned with young men developing skills to attract young women, often in quite misogynistic ways. On the other end of the spectrum, you have groups like incel spaces, involuntary celibate groups, where young men decry the fact that they've been denied sexual access to women's bodies and can sometimes celebrate the use of violence as a remedy to that. The manosphere evolved initially out of backlash movements against feminism. These were groups of men's rights activists, fathers' rights activists, and others who were interested in the politics of men, often in response to feminism. Different branches of the manosphere have taken up very different aspects of that ideology, and lots of them don't explicitly argue for violence. But within male-dominated groups, you do see a coalescence between certain parts of the manosphere that says feminism has wrecked society, that the increasing role of women has displaced men, and the only way to address that is through the use of violence. And you do increasingly see connections there also on anti-queer politics, that the manosphere makes the argument, not always, but often, that the prevalence of gender diversity and sexual diversity has undermined cis heterosexual men's place in society, and that there needs to be a return to a previous gendered order where men are straight, monogamous, and have access to individual women's bodies. So you have a few different dynamics. One is not extremist groups directly, but what are sometimes, I think, not very helpfully referred to as lone wolf actors, or individuals who do specific acts of terror. There have been quite a few examples of men, especially associated with incel forums, who have done individual attacks. The Toronto van attack, for example, Elliot Rogers, the Alta Vista killing. These are often young men who join the manosphere through individual grievances that they've had around lack of access to women's bodies, as I would think of it, or they would describe it as being forced to be celibate in their life. And these spaces are spaces of individual radicalization through interactions with other men who have similar grievances. There is a valorization of violent responses to that and the need to put women back in their place, and also often to punish other men that they see as doing things incorrectly. There is a distinct and separate dynamic where the manosphere crosses over with other far-right online spaces. So this would be ethno-nationalist spaces, for example, spaces that were racist, and that is often a recruitment pathway where an initial interest into something which is quite banal, for example, the self-help work of someone like Jordan Peterson, can begin a process of an individual being interested in related politics, and that can then lead them into groups that often actively recruit from men who've been involved in the manosphere. But I think it's worth pointing out that these processes are not necessarily linear. It's not like if someone begins to follow Andrew Tate, the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to become a terrorist. Instead, they are often operating in similar milieus. They are in the same spaces of far-right politics, reactionary politics, anti-feminist politics, anti-queer politics, and people who want to recruit people who might be likely to be able to join those groups know that this is a fertile field to plough those messages. And so you see the resentment around women's role in society, the resentment around the displacement of what they see as white men in society, both being prevalent within aspects of the manosphere and within more explicitly violent far-right groups. But it's a distinct process to the one with, for example, people who are called incels. So militarization refers to the process whereby something which has previously not been constructed as being about the military values, military aesthetics, war making, war preparedness, becomes increasingly associated with it. You can see this in really mundane ways. For example, the language that was used around COVID, that we were having blitz spirit, mobilizing against COVID, or the war on drugs, the war on terror. But you also see it in much more subtle ways. The role of military aesthetics in fashion or gaming. Lots of young men spend their weekends playing video games which are centered over role-playing as military actors. You see it in pop culture like movies. Militarization is theorized by authors like Cynthia Enloe as having a way in which it makes society centered around military goals and constructing violent responses to problems as necessary and acceptable. Military values and the role of the military in society have a complicated relationship with masculinity. Often very mainstream ideas around what it means to be a man are connected to ideas around what the military should do. For example, the idea of service, idea of duty, of self-sacrifice, things that we might think of as being really positive, but they often are constructed as distinctly masculine. To be manly is to have something like being connected to the military, or at least military values. At the same time, militaries are often very male-dominated organizations, and so there is a symbiotic relationship here about how these two things interact. There is not a single way that men within extremist organizations relate to women. The role of women, as research on this topic from people like Catherine Brown has shown, and Swati Purusha, for example, really varies massively across contexts. There are contexts where women are commanders and leaders within violent extremist organizations. There are examples where women are frontline combatants. For example, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a significant proportion of their suicide bombers were women. In other contexts, women are completely devoid from organizations and not allowed to join. It's massively varies. In the context where I was working in Indonesia with foreign fighters who were associated with Islamist groups, women up until quite recently had not been combatants, had not been doing direct acts of violence within those organizations. That was previously seen to be unacceptable. However, women played really important roles. They were essential to recruitment processes. They did a lot of logistics work. Relationships between men and women were also really key to keeping men within organizations. Men who'd been involved in the networks would often marry other commanders' daughters, and that link to their spouse made it very difficult for them to leave because they had these familial relationships through the networks. But it varies massively depending on the kind of organization and the ideology that they'd hold. I would say there is also the broader symbolic role of women within almost all violent extremist organizations. There's often discussion around protection of women or protection of innocence. And so the figure of women plays a really important role, even if women aren't as directly involved in the violence of those organizations. Violent extremism often functions by appealing not to extreme or marginal values and expectations that are placed on men. It often functions by appealing to very mainstream and acceptable expectations that are placed on men, and then shifting their focus to the use of violence in ways that are not socially condoned. In order to address the fact that violent extremist organizations are often appealing to a certain segment of young men, you can't just address the symptoms of hegemonic masculinities, particularly patriarchal ones that celebrate men's violence, and then be surprised when they are appealing to groups of young men. If you are wanting to do a more preventative approach to violent extremism, then it would be essential to address the fact that many cultures celebrate young men for risk-taking, the use of violence, close association with male peers. That process, though, is very difficult because it doesn't just involve challenging a fringe group of men who are often socially marginalized, are often racialized or demonized on the basis of their religious or class background. It involves a degree of social introspection about how very mainstream ideas around masculinity might be harmful and valorize violence. That process, I would argue, is essential and one that I've been very interested in my work. But very often when we look at the ways in which especially governments have engaged with the context of masculinity, what they want to do is bracket off a category of bad masculinities, of bad men, men who don't know how to be men correctly and are using violence. There's not the same interest in interrogating how very mainstream expectations and processes of socialization make young men ready to be recruited. So I think it is essential, but it's difficult work, and I'm not always convinced there's the appetite to actually prevent violent extremism. Feminists' insights, I think, have a tremendous amount to say about preventing violent extremism. If you think about feminist work on violence, it has been often about drawing on the knowledges of groups of people whose perspectives have been marginalized in many topics. When you're talking about violent extremism, there is a tremendous reservoir of knowledge from people in the communities that are often recruited to violent groups and from the communities that they often target about how violence functions. Feminists and Black scholars have often used the concept of standpoint, the way that we are shaped in our knowledge of the world by who we are, as a principle for uncovering knowledge. For example, to talk about this practically, W.E.B. Du Bois would say that Black people in a society like Britain will have special insight about how racism works, and not just about Black people's experiences, but about how white people behave. Feminists will also argue that women and queer people will often have specific insights about how men behave because in order to survive, they need to navigate men's violence and the violent expectations that men place on one another. Feminist approaches can help us deconstruct the sets of practices and expectations that men are required to do, but are often completely invisible. In a patriarchal society, behavior around masculinity is rendered unseeable to most men, even though the very particular expectations that we're put through to endure violence, to be ready to do it, to see it as an acceptable response, are not inevitable, are not natural or biological. Feminist accounts can help those who are interested in preventing violent extremism go to some of those root causes. When it comes to the countering violent extremism framework, I think that is much harder. A lot of the countering violent extremism framework has been focused on reactive responses to those who are already involved in violent groups. That's a much more difficult thing to do from a feminist perspective, although people have done that, for example, by drawing on the knowledge of women in communities that are affected by violent extremism, who often will know more about who might be more likely to join. But I think there is also real concerns about how the women are being instrumentalized in those contexts and the way in which those who want to use that knowledge might not be doing it in a particularly feminist way. Men who get involved in violent extremist groups, networks, and politics often have specific ideals about what they want to protect, how they want to restore some sense of order. Foster and Mackenzie refer to this as masculinity nostalgia, the idea that things were better at some point in the past. When it comes to ethno-nationalism, nationalism is often constructed in intensely gendered terms. The nation as woman who needs to be protected, for example. And there's been a tremendous amount of work, especially from intersectional feminists like Yuval Davis, that make the argument that we construct nationalism through gendered language that then calls on men to be protectors and be fighters. When it comes to methodological nationalism, this can be quite complicated. We tend to think about the world through the lens of nations. We think about men involved in violent extremism in the context that I live in. You might say, what are British masculinities like? What are British violent extremist groups like? For some contexts, this works. If you're involved in a British ethno-nationalist movement, well then, yeah, it makes sense to talk about it as British. But for lots of other groups where their goals are not national, but they might be transnational or local, or a mixture of those things, the framing of them through nationalist terms makes it impossible to see the dynamics of how their lives have been shaped. I'll use a practical example to hopefully illustrate this. Some of the men that I've worked with in Indonesia, in conjunction with Dr. Nurhuda Ismail, they were men who were recruited by a violent international network. And their politics is largely about opposing both the Indonesian state and almost all forms of nation states. They think that society should be organized on the basis of international religious order. And to do that, they first traveled to Malaysia and then Afghanistan to be foreign fighters. They learned different ways to be fighters in those contexts, different expectations placed on men. They then came back to Indonesia, took part in intercommunal conflicts in Ambon and Poso, and then after that, went off to the Philippines to train others. Should we think about these men primarily as Indonesian foreign fighters when their experience has been as much shaped by time in Afghanistan or the Philippines? Or should we think about the way in which their role as foreign fighters and their role as men is transnational? Very often the nationalist framework that we use hides the fact that different dynamics are going on here and that the concept of the nation is hiding as much as it's illuminating. Masculinity in most contexts is contested between different groups in society, and there are often economic and international trends that challenge the way in which men are expected to behave. So while in the UK that might be about economic shifts away from heavy industry into the service industries for working class boys, In a context, for example, like in Indonesia, there's been this huge rise in an interest in religious extremism and sort of more hardline religious politics. This is connected to the fact that young men especially are marginalized from political power in that space. It's not a shift away from industry in that context, but it's about intergenerational bargaining, who actually gets to control the resources and political power. And an older secular authority, which has historically excluded young men, gets challenged through an appeal to a different kind of masculinity. In other contexts, it's about the development of heavier industries or manufacturing in a context that hasn't had them previously, that breaks down former ways in which men might gain access to status through secret societies or age sets, land ownership. So the dynamic is quite different. I think you do see lots of similarities to patterns within other violent groups, though. Some of the work has drawn comparisons between violent extremist groups and gangs. Others have compared it to biker groups that you see in lots of contexts. But often it's about a segment of men in society who either don't have much position or authority and use violence as a mechanism for claiming that, or about groups of men who are having specific appeals being made to them about their obligation as men to protect or look after people in their space.